What happens when the big screen dares to imagine the future, but the audience just isn't ready? The 1960s gave us some of the boldest sci-fi experiments ever made, films dripping with ideas, ambition, and visual flair. But many of them stumbled hard when ticket sales came in. Were they too weird? Too ahead of their time? Maybe both. Let's uncover 11 sci-fi flops from the 60s that turned out to be unforgettable classics. Barbarella, 1968. A space queen in go-go boots, saving the galaxy with style. That's how Barbarella landed on paper and on screen. It became something even stranger. Directed by Roger Vadim and starring Jane Fonda at the peak of her star power, the film was a psychedelic swirl of colorful set surreal creatures and tongue-in-cheek humor. Yet, when it debuted in 1968, American audiences weren't sure what to make of it. Some thought it was too campy. Others dismissed it as nonsensical. The result? A box office disappointment. But here's the twist: time has been incredibly kind to Barbarella. What critics once called silly is now celebrated as bold. Its kaleidoscopic visuals and outrageous costumes influenced music videos in the 80s and fashion designers well into the 2000s. Pop icons from Kylie Minogue to Lady Gaga have pulled inspiration from its space-age couture. And beyond fashion, Barbarella's candy-colored weirdness shaped the way filmmakers approached sci-fi worlds that didn't have to be gritty or realistic to be memorable. Jane Fonda herself later admitted she was confused about how to play the role at first, but her mix of innocence and sly wit gave Barbarella an oddball charm that endures. And while audiences laughed at its cheesiness back then, the film's self-awareness now feels refreshing. It wasn't trying to be 2001, A Space Odyssey. It was something else entirely, a comic strip brought to life. Today, Barbarella is a cult classic with legions of fans who embrace its offbeat energy. It's the kind of movie you don't just watch, you experience, like stepping into a pop art daydream. What was once seen as a failure has become a badge of honor, proving that sometimes the wildest ideas are the ones that stick. The Damned, 1963. Imagine discovering a group of children hidden away, glowing with radiation, destined for a future no one dares face. That's the eerie premise of Joseph Losey's The Damned, a British sci-fi drama that blended Cold War paranoia with Gothic atmosphere. Released in 1963, it should have been a hit. Instead, it was hacked apart by censors, re-edited into a confusing mess, and largely ignored by audiences. The film begins like a biker drama with Oliver Reed leading a gang of leather-jacketed thugs. But the story soon shifts into something much stranger. A tourist stumbles upon a military base where children are being raised in secret. These kids are not normal. They're radioactive, unable to touch another human without causing harm. They represent the next generation of humanity designed to survive a nuclear future, yet doomed to live in isolation. Censors in both the UK and the US were nervous about the film's bleak themes, so the studio chopped it up before release. Key scenes were removed and the pacing became uneven. Audiences barely noticed it, and critics at the time were baffled. For years, The Damned was written off as a misfire, but rediscovered decades later, the film's brilliance finally came into focus. Joseph Losey, an American director exiled in Britain during the Red Scare, layered the story with biting social commentary. The children aren't just radioactive, they're metaphors for innocence corrupted by political fear. The contrast between the rowdy bikers, the cold government agents, and the glowing children creates a chilling sense of inevitability. Modern critics hail The Damned as one of the most daring British sci-fi films of the 60s. Its stark black and white cinematography, eerie seaside locations, and haunting performances give it a timeless quality. What once looked like a failure now feels prophetic, a movie that captured the anxieties of its era and still resonates in ours. Robinson Crusoe on Mars, 1964. Stranded, alone, no rescue in sight. That's the nightmare scenario Robinson Crusoe on Mars explored long before actual astronauts set foot on the moon. Directed by Byron Haskin, the man behind War of the Worlds, this 1964 sci-fi survival tale dared to strip away pulp heroics and ask a simple question. What would it really be like to be marooned on the Red Planet? The setup mirrors the famous novel, only this time, instead of a desert island, it's the barren alien landscape of Mars. An astronaut crashes after a mission goes wrong, leaving him to survive with limited supplies, dwindling oxygen, and only a monkey for company. Yes, a monkey. It sounds absurd on paper, but the film treats the premise with such sincerity that it becomes gripping. At the time, though, audiences didn't buy it. The movie struggled at the box office, overshadowed by flashier fare and dismissed as too slow. Many sci-fi films in the early 60s leaned on bug-eyed monsters or campy thrills. Robinson Crusoe on Mars dared to go the opposite direction, scientific, methodical, almost meditative. And in doing so, it quietly paved the way for films like The Martian decades later. The production used stunning location shooting in Death Valley to mimic Martian terrain. Combined with eerie matte paintings, it created a believable otherworldly atmosphere. The attention to detail was ahead of its time. Oxygen systems, food rationing, even the psychological toll of isolation were depicted with surprising realism. Over time, critics came to appreciate just how smart this film really was. It may have flopped in 1964, but today, Robinson Crusoe on Mars is seen as one of the most intelligent pre-space race sci-fi adventures, a movie that imagined the Red Planet not as a playground for monsters, but as a survival challenge for humanity itself. The Green Slime, 1968. Green tentacled creatures invading a space station sounds like a midnight B-movie, right? That's exactly what audiences thought when The Green Slime premiered in 1968. A Japanese-American co-production directed by Kinji Fukasaku, the film promised outlandish thrills, rubbery monsters, and flashing lights, and it delivered those in spades. But at the box office, disaster. Audiences shrugged it off as ridiculous and critics tore it apart. Here's the catch. The Green Slime was never trying to be serious sci-fi. It was gleefully pulpy, a Saturday matinee blown up to widescreen. The story centers on astronauts who destroy an asteroid, only to bring back a deadly alien organism that multiplies every time it's injured. Soon, the space station is overrun with glowing-eyed creatures that look like someone stitched together an octopus with a Christmas tree. Yes, it's campy. Yes, the monsters wobble when they walk, but that's exactly why the film has endured. The Green Slime captured the spirit of late 60s pulp sci-fi like few films ever did. It was so wild and over the top that it ended up inspiring future parody shows like Mystery Science Theater 3000, where it became a fan favorite. And beneath the rubber suits, the film actually touched on themes of arrogance and scientific hubris. The astronauts' belief that they can control the unknown backfires spectacularly, a message that feels surprisingly modern. Add to that an unforgettable psychedelic theme song and vibrant color cinematography, and you've got a film that may have been a flop, but is impossible to forget. Today, The Green Slime is embraced as a cult classic. It's the kind of film that reminds you not every sci-fi story has to be profound. Sometimes it's about having fun, watching glowing creatures swarm a space station while a wah-wah guitar blasts on the soundtrack. Seconds. 1966. What if you could trade in your life for a brand new one? That's the chilling question John Frankenheimer's Seconds asked in 1966. On paper, it was a sci-fi thriller about identity and reinvention. In practice, it was a haunting masterpiece that bombed spectacularly on release. Audiences didn't just reject it, they walked out in confusion. The plot follows a middle-aged banker who feels trapped in his dull suburban life. Through a mysterious organization, he's given a chance to fake his death and be reborn with a new face, new body, and a new identity. He emerges as a younger man played by Rock Hudson in one of his boldest roles. But what begins as a fantasy of freedom quickly curdles into a nightmare. He doesn't fit in, doesn't belong, and the shiny new life he bought starts to feel like a prison. Audiences in the 60s weren't ready for a film this bleak. Hudson, known for light romantic comedies, shocked fans with his intense performance. Frankenheimer's direction leaned heavily on experimental camera work, distorted lenses, surreal angles, and claustrophobic shots that made the film visually unsettling. Critics dismissed it as pretentious, and the box office was a disaster. But decades later, Seconds has been reclaimed as a visionary work. Its themes of identity, consumerism, and the illusion of reinvention feel more relevant now than ever. The film's unsettling mood influenced later psychological thrillers and sci-fi explorations of selfhood. What once seemed baffling is now seen as profound. Seconds may have died at the theater, But it lives on as one of the boldest and most haunting sci-fi films of the 60s, a film that forces you to ask, if you could start over, would you really be happier? Or would you just be a stranger in your own skin? Quatermass and the Pit, 1967. When archaeologists dig up ancient bones and find something that isn't human, you know trouble is coming. That's the spine-chilling setup of Quatermass and the Pit Hammer Studios' sci-fi horror gem from 1967. Directed by Roy Ward Baker, it was the third in the Quatermass series, and arguably the best, but in theaters it barely registered outside the UK. The story begins with construction workers uncovering what looks like a buried spacecraft in a London subway tunnel. Enter Professor Quatermass, who suspects the object isn't just old, it's extraterrestrial. As scientists investigate, they realize the craft may have been buried for millions of years, and that the strange insect-like creatures inside could be connected to humanity's origins. The chilling idea. What if our evolution was nudged by alien hands and those instincts could still be awakened? Hammer was known for gothic horror, but here they leaned into eerie science fiction with terrifying results. The film's practical effects, while modest, were unsettling, and the atmosphere was thick with dread. Scenes of Londoners succumbing to psychic hysteria turned everyday city streets into a nightmare landscape. So why did it flop? Timing. Hammer's reputation for B-movie thrills made some critics dismiss it, while American distribution was botched, limiting its reach. Audiences who expected vampires and monsters didn't quite know how to process a story about alien manipulation of human evolution. But today, Quatermass and the Pit is hailed as a classic. It's creepy, thought-provoking, and oddly prophetic, exploring themes of inherited violence and mass panic. Its influence can be seen in everything from The X-Files to John Carpenter's Prince of Darkness. Once a financial letdown, it's now remembered as one of Hammer's boldest and most unsettling achievements. Marooned, 1969. 3 astronauts, 1 failing spacecraft, a world watching helplessly. That's the gripping premise of Marooned, directed by John Sturges and released in 1969. It should have been a blockbuster. After all, the world had just watched the real Apollo 11 moon landing a few months earlier. Instead, the film flopped. The plot is brutally simple and terrifying. After a mission goes wrong, 3 American astronauts find themselves stranded in orbit with limited oxygen and no way home. Down on Earth, NASA scrambles to figure out a rescue mission before time runs out. It was one of the first films to treat space travel with realistic tension rather than pulp spectacle. The film's technical accuracy was praised. NASA even cooperated with production to ensure details felt authentic. Gene Hackman, Richard Crenna, and James Franciscus carried the weight of the doomed astronauts, while Gregory Peck played the NASA director under crushing pressure. The movie builds its suspense not through action, but through agonizing waiting. Every breath feels like it might be the last. But here's the problem. Reality overshadowed fiction. By the time Marooned hit theaters, audiences had already lived through the triumphant moon landing and didn't want to pay to watch astronauts fail. The film's grim tone contrasted sharply with the optimism of the space race, making it a commercial dud. Years later, though, critics gave Marooned a second look. Its quiet realism anticipated Apollo 13 decades later, and its focus on the human cost of space exploration still resonates. The movie even won the Academy Award for Best Visual Effects, proving its technical artistry. Today, Marooned stands as an underrated gem, an authentic survival story lost in the shadow of real history. Planet of the Vampires, 1965. Before Alien terrified audiences, Mario Bava's Planet of the Vampires laid the groundwork. Released in 1965, this Italian space horror was unlike anything else at the time: lush visuals, eerie landscapes, and a creeping sense of doom. But in theaters? A box office dud, especially outside Europe. The story follows 2 spacecraft responding to a distress signal on a mysterious planet. Once they land, the crew members begin turning on each other under a strange influence. Soon it becomes clear that an ancient alien force is trying to take over their bodies. The plot might sound familiar because Ridley Scott's Alien owes more than a little to this forgotten film. What set Planet of the Vampires apart was its style. Bava, a master of Italian horror, created stunning otherworldly visuals on a shoestring budget. Using colored lights, fog machines, and inventive set design, he turned cardboard sets into alien landscapes, dripping with atmosphere. The costumes, black leather spacesuits with neon piping, looked absurd to some critics at the time, but now they're iconic in their own right. Audiences in 1965 weren't impressed. Many dismissed it as cheap Euro schlock, and American distribution was limited. The title didn't help either. There weren't even traditional vampires, which confused viewers. It seemed destined to fade into obscurity. But in hindsight, Planet of the Vampires feels revolutionary. Its sense of cosmic dread, its idea of alien parasites using humans as hosts, and its haunting visuals all laid the foundation for later sci-fi horror. Filmmakers from Ridley Scott to John Carpenter have cited it as inspiration. What was once written off as a disposable B-movie is now respected as a visionary cult classic. The Power, 1968. What if the most dangerous weapon wasn't a machine, but the human mind? That's the unnerving premise of The Power, released in 1968 by MGM. Based on Frank M. Robinson's novel, the film told a story of psychic dominance, shadowy conspiracies, and the fear that someone among us could bend reality with a thought. Despite its ambitious hook, it was a box office flop. The story centers on a group of scientists researching the limits of human capability. When one of them dies under mysterious circumstances, suspicion grows that someone in the group has developed terrifying psychic abilities. George Hamilton plays Professor Jim Tanner, who slowly realizes he may be the next target of this hidden adversary. The mystery blends into paranoia as ordinary spaces, offices, streets, labs turn into battlegrounds for invisible powers. Audiences in 1968 weren't impressed. The film lacked flashy action, and its cerebral nature was hard to market. Critics dismissed it as confusing, and Hamilton's casting in a serious sci-fi thriller didn't help sell the stakes. MGM had hoped for a prestige picture, but instead, it fizzled out quietly. Yet, decades later, The Power looks far more interesting. Its ideas about hidden control, mental manipulation, and paranoia predate films like Scanners and The Fury. The cinematography by Irwin Hillier adds surreal touches, from distorted camera angles to bizarre montages that visualize the unseen battle of wills. And the score by Miklos Rozsa, haunting and dramatic, gives the film an eerie gravitas. Modern audiences see it as a gem of Cold War paranoia, dressed up as science fiction. It's not perfect, but it's brave, weird, and daring, a film that asked unsettling questions about the power lurking inside us. Voyage to the End of the Universe, 1963. Before Stanley Kubrick made 2001, the Czechs quietly got there first. Ikari XB1, released internationally as Voyage to the End of the Universe in 1963, was a Czech production that envisioned deep space travel with surprising realism and philosophical weight. But in most countries, the film bombed. The plot follows the crew of the starship Ikari as they journey beyond our solar system toward a distant planet. Along the way, they face isolation, psychological strain, and the eerie discovery of a derelict alien ship. Unlike the pulpy sci-fi of its era, Ikari XB1 leaned into atmosphere, character, and slow-building tension. When it was imported into the US, distributors re-edited and dubbed it, badly, even tacking on a cheesy happy ending that wasn't in the original. That version flopped, and audiences dismissed it. The original Czech cut barely made it out of Eastern Europe, so most of the world missed its brilliance. But modern critics have called Ikari XB1 a masterpiece. Its production design, sleek spacecraft interiors, futuristic costumes, and eerie lighting was decades ahead of Hollywood. It's widely believed Kubrick saw it before making 2001, with similarities in pacing, visuals, and mood that are hard to ignore. Rediscovered in restored form, the film is now recognized as one of the most important European sci-fi works of the 60s. Once dismissed, it's now admired as the thinking person's space odyssey. The Illustrated Man, 1969. Ray Bradbury's stories brought to life should have been an instant hit. Instead, The Illustrated Man, released in 1969, was a puzzling flop. Starring Rod Steiger and Claire Bloom, the film adapted 3 of Bradbury's short stories, tied together by a framing device about a man whose tattoos reveal haunting visions of the future. On paper, it sounded perfect. Bradbury's name recognition, Steiger's acting chops, and the late 60s appetite for experimental cinema. But the execution was too strange for mainstream audiences. The film weaves together tales of space colonists, apocalyptic endings, and moral dilemmas, all seen through Steiger's tormented character. Critics complained it was disjointed, too bleak, and hard to follow. Financially, it tanked. Audiences expecting pulpy thrills were instead confronted with philosophical musings and surreal imagery. Even Steiger's intense performance full of brooding energy couldn't win them over. By the end of 1969, The Illustrated Man had been written off as a failure. But over the years, appreciation has grown. Fans of Bradbury recognize how faithful the film was to his themes of loneliness, morality, and humanity's struggle with technology. The film's dreamlike structure, once seen as a flaw, now feels daring. And visually, its shifting tones from the bleakness of space to the intimacy of its earthbound moments carry an artistry that critics initially overlooked. Today, The Illustrated Man sits comfortably in the cult category. It's imperfect, yes, but it captures Bradbury's voice in a way few adaptations ever have. What once looked like a mess now feels like a flawed gem. So there you have it. 11 60s sci-fi films that bombed hard at the box office but refused to stay buried. They remind us that ticket sales don't always measure greatness. Sometimes the boldest, weirdest visions need decades to find their audience. Which of these forgotten gems have you seen? Drop your pick in the comments, hit subscribe for more deep dives into hidden cinema, and share this with a friend who loves sci-fi history.